Okay, welcome back everybody. I hope you're all settling into the second day of the symposium. You've all made it over here to the other venue. And it's going to give me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Amy Gorman. Amy currently works as a curator of education and new media at the Gogh Museum of Art at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, as well as finding the time to research, consult, and act as the executive editor of an online chronicle of museum research. Amy's been teaching studio arts for 10 years now, which led her to a doctoral work in museums, and she's quoted as saying, "The art museum has unlimited potential of how we can present objects and information. We have such possibilities in the way we present the object and information that we can connect to audiences in entirely new and deeper ways." So on that note, I'd like to welcome Amy and say how much I'm looking forward to her presentation, and hand it over to you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very happy to be here, very excited to talk about museums in the new media space and in relation to lifelong learners. Alan, if we can have the first slide, please. So today we're going to talk about museums as lifelong learners and the capabilities, but we need to do some background work. Museums have always been places of learning, but it's only in modern history that we see them as truly educational institutions. All the way back to the origins of cabinets of curiosity and wonder rooms, as they were known to, we see practices in object-centered learning. After all, the distinctive aspect of museums is in their collection and display of objects. Whether it reflects a discipline, a person, or historical events, the objects have always been the basis for public interface. Museum educators know that objects are the starting point, not the ending point of a visitor's experience, because objects stimulate through thought and reflection. In historical museums, objects become cues for institutional memories or past events, but they are also cues for personally reconstructed memories. In art museums, objects offer an opportunity to explore both historically and internally. Viewing objects allows visitors to recreate and embrace their personal memories, to express their ownership of the experience, and to share stories with others. The notion of story is crucial when considering knowledge derived from objects, because we know that objects on display may have inert knowledge in the same way as facts on a page. If we can have the next slide, please. According to an array of physicists, time travel is not possible, or is it? Our bodies may not be able to physically travel back in time to a specific moment, but our minds do through the exploration of objects that museums have collected and preserved. Like snapshots in our photo albums, the art and artifacts of the last 10,000 years has been collected, conserved, preserved, and on display for us to journey back to that moment. It is through the perpetual interpretation of these objects that we're able to learn about our past and appreciate our cultures. Interpretation is everything that is beyond and surrounds the object, from the way an object is displayed to the text that it accompanies it. Every aspect funnels into the interpretation of that object for the experience of the audience. Changing philosophies guiding museums' focus has brought an additional emphasis on interpretation and education within each institution. Museums are now brokers of information and experience, not just collections of objects on display. Even without words and heavy interpretation, the mere presentation of the objects on display influences our interactions with those objects. As curators intertwine stories and symbolisms into every aspect. The landscape of museum interpretation has definitely changed dramatically over the past 30 years or so, and this is never so prevalent as we see in the new medias and new technologies that have been implemented in the museum and online. If we can have the next slide, please. If we look back over the last 20 years, we see computer kiosks, audio tours, interactive displays, and an array of what we consider now ancient technologies being implemented in the museum. But these are not necessarily new concepts for the museum. After all, what is an audio tour but an automated docent tour, which has a much longer tradition in the museum? It does establish two things, however. First, that museums do utilize the latest technologies at their disposal, but more importantly, it emphasizes that shift to user-centered learning. So how does that translate to lifelong learning in the museum? First, lifelong learning is just as it is. It addresses learning from elementary school through college, into the workplace, and through senior years. The museum has a long tradition of lifelong learning and the opportunity of the pursuit of knowledge. For school-age children, we use the museum as an extension of the classroom. There's a great flexibility of the way we can present information in the museum that is not possible in the classroom. The museum offers alternative ways of seeing and thinking to engage students in critical and creative thinking skills. In the museum, we hope that this fosters an interest that will carry with them through life, and for most it does. On the other side of life, we see a lot of people gain interest during their senior years as they have more time to develop hobbies and engage in the interests they have longed for. It is in this middle age and the work life that we start to see a drop in museum interest. There are still plenty of adults attending museums, but we find that their motivations are not always their own. Family groups often come to the museum to bring their children, as it was an activity that they experienced and they want to impart on their children. That same experience with every group, regardless of motivation for attending, we want to ensure a captivating, engaging experience with the audience. And we'll see throughout this lecture that lifelong learning is achieved in that middle group through new media possibilities. If we can have the next slide, please. When we look at Hind's theory of learning and knowledge, we see the possible methods museums use for interpretation. The systematic museum uses traditional teaching methods or a more formal approach. This is demonstrated in the museum by using audio tours and labels, standards in museums. The orderly museum is also based on the museum as authority, but stresses the importance of environmental influences, like the display and setting of an object. Just like conditioning, it also relies on repetition and reinforcement. Discovery learning is just that. The user learns through discovery. Most proponents of discovery learning think that the user must have an experience in order to learn. We see this mostly in science and children's museums and in interactive kiosks. The Constructivist Museum is the latest trend in museums. It argues that both knowledge and the way it is obtained are dependent upon the mind of the learner, or in other words, the user constructs their own understanding and knowledge through the cues given. With the exception of many children's discovery centers, few museums fit solely into one quadrant, but this gives you an idea of where a museum can fall in respect to the institutional philosophy and the attention to the user that guides the interpretation and display of objects. It is in these educational focuses that we truly see the use and need for new and emerging media. The moral of the story, so to speak, is that these different types of museums are focused for different types of learners, and within new media and emerging technologies, we are able to meet those needs simultaneously. When the museum engages in basic new media practices, they are able to accommodate an array of learning styles. To create a lifelong learner, we must engage the person in a personal way in order to make a lasting impression and personal meaning making. Next slide, please. So what are museums doing today to use new media? As with most of our lives, we see the most growth over online capabilities. Museums are creating a web presence for their institution that is reflective of engaging the viewer. We see here a search engine from the Museum of Modern Art to search their collections. Having a searchable database online is pretty much a standard practice for museums. It is, however, often scrutinized because some critics claim that if it is accessible online, it will discourage people from going to see the object in person. Of course, online collections are not new, just the technology and the rampantness of them. We can compare them to published books, and even earlier we compare them to printmaking. We want people around the world to see our collections, and the online market allows us a larger audience. It's a way to share the collections with those that will never be able to see it in person, but also has the potential to share the collection with someone that never had the intention to use the collection to begin with. As we will see in new trends, museums are using the current technologies to spread ideas about their collection and to solicit new audience members and untapped participants. Next slide, please. For anyone that has been able to experiment with Microsoft Pivot, as we see on the slide here, you've seen the possible future of museum collections. This program allows you to search a collection through a visual database. As you filter your searches through the grids, move to show current views, allowing users to customize how they are searching, and enables a different avenue and different perspective to find what they're looking for, or maybe to find something new that they didn't know they were looking for. Using a graphic interface, online museum users will be able to explore a collection in completely different ways. As they filter down the selections, and see what they are filtering, or rather, as results are coming up, they'll be able to make more personal choices on what the next filter is, rather than the current models of collections that filter according to what the curators have determined fits into that category. The categories will remain, but the cross-referencing becomes personalized. This personalization is the key in sustaining lifelong learners by making those personal connections. The curators are always the interpreters, Lisa. There's no doubt about that. But this allows the person to connect with the interpretation that the curator has given. There's much debate in the museum world about giving this power into the individual, and curators are frightened of it, and museums are frightened of it. They don't want to give up their authority. However, we need to make a bridge between the authority of the museum and the personal touch of the individual. If the individual doesn't see a voice or doesn't see themselves represented in that collection, they're not going to have that deeper connection, and they're not going to perpetually visit the museum or the collection. So it's definitely that balance between keeping museum authority and creating interactive experiences. While Pivot is a new technology, we see similar campaigns and treatments working already. The Brooklyn Museum, for example, started a campaign to tag its collection to build their searchable database, putting the power of interpretation into the viewers. This does not decant any authority that the museum has, but it allows a broader audience to contribute what someone might search for in the general public, because the curators have their perspectives, but now the public can add what they would search for to find that painting. As did the Metropolitan Museum, whose collection you can search and select images to create your own collection, to reference back to essentially curating your own exhibition, or personalizing the collection for you. Putting the power of organizing and searching collections into the viewers is one of our first steps in building interest for the viewer, and giving them substantial power over the use of the collection is a key element to building that engagement on a personal level. May we get the next slide, please? Social media, of course, pretty much rules most of our lives at the moment, as it does business as well. In the museum, we offer the visitor to stay in touch with the museum, even while they are not able to visit, through behind-the-scenes Flickr images, Twitter updates, to insightful curatorial blogs. Avenues in social media, unlike searchable databases, allow the visitor to engage with the institution directly as well as with other patrons. This socialized activity is a crucial component to lifelong learning because we know that learning is not isolated. It is a social activity. Even when reading a book alone, that user is reading a book of another person's ideas and thoughts. When we can engage the viewer in conversation, they will be that much more engaged to join the discussion for a lifetime. We can go back to Constance's talk just before this one, and about how that concept is that it's not that those kids were not willing or able to read at that level, they didn't have the interest to. And this is the same thing that we're trying to engage in the museum. We're trying to build that interest. Next slide, please. online collections and social media outlets are crucial parts of museums using technology. But when we look at the core of these practices, we are still using them as extensions or more convenient methods of traditional museum activities. The online collection allows museums to show more of their collection that they would have physical space for, but it is still relatively similar to an exhibition, just through a different medium. The same is true with social media. It has absolutely opened up the conversation, but any avid museum goer already gets that experience from each visit and interacting with staff and other patrons. We can, however, step into the next level of engagement, which is immersion. Is Second Life new? No. Is it new to museums? No. But utilizing it gives an entirely new possibility. For example, the Space Museum in Second Life has brought together every vessel ever rocketed to space. This would physically be impossible to do in a real-life setting. Yet in Second Life, you can learn about the entire history of space exploration. But maybe more impressive or more engaging is the Van Gogh Museum. Here we see a snapshot of the museum. An individual took the time to physically recreate famous pieces of Van Gogh. So you are literally immersed in the painting. You can even interact with the actual objects. Is this the pinnacle of what virtual experiences can be? Absolutely not. The Virtue Sphere is another product that has created a walkable environment where you can walk the ancient cities of Pompeii or immerse yourself in historic battles. Virtual realities have the opportunity to engage the viewers in what-ifs, where they can experience things on a level not physically possible in the museum or in any other place. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. So the key to lifelong learning is engagement, allowing learners to make personal connections that will carry through every part of their life. Here we see the 4 general categories of life, and while these are equally distributed, we know that this chart changes for each individual. For example, some people put major emphasis on school, collecting multiple degrees, seemingly never ending as a student. It is also notable that school does not refer to purpose. Purposeful or intentional learning. It can be formal or informal. This is where step 1 of the museum comes in. When we can give the experience of the museum as a school or learning environment, we can engage them to use the museum beyond school. For long periods of time, museum educators have always tried to engage younger children to encourage that behavior as they get older. In our family learning time, we use the museum as a social spot to share experience and knowledge based on collection objects. We do the same thing with our hobbies and interests. We use the museum to learn more or to share with others, utilizing both entertainment and educational aspects of the museum. I would challenge anyone to not find a museum that relates to any hobby or interest in the world. In other words, there's something for everyone. Of course, I specialize in not just object-based learning, but arts-based learning, and I would challenge anyone to find a topic that cannot be related to a work of art. After all, art is a reflection of society, and such as art is ingrained in all of our experiences already. In the Art Museum in particular, we teach pre-service teachers how to use the collections and make connections based on one work of art to what they're working on in the curriculum to make lasting meaning. The career section is where we get a little fuzzy for museum interactions, and it's in the same period of time when we've got this middle-aged audience that we're always striving to captivate. It is possible to have a successful career and never enter a museum, of course, but to greatly generalize an example, imagine how much socializing is required in business, and theoretically, you need intelligible things to discuss. So again, very generally, but we could surmise that each museum experience can contribute to your skills in communicating with others. More directly, I'm a strong proponent of volunteering or interning at a museum at a pre-professional level. I believe no matter what career you intend on going, experience in the museum can help you prepare for it. Combining the different departments of museums, it canvasses academic research, educational theory, business administration, marketing and sales, visitor and customer services, just to name a few. And of course, now we're seeing museums as a great technological research center. So these areas are essential to a person's life concerns or potential learning areas, each of which the museum is capable of matching and meeting the needs. There is another dimension, however, and again I have to reference Constance's talk just an hour ago. She mentioned Oldenburg's third place. The third place is a crucial component to the success of the museum. If anyone has not heard of this concept, it's the theory that you have your work and your home, but then you have that third place. It could be a church, a bar, or a museum, but it's that part of your life that's beyond your work and home. It isn't just a part of your social issues, but it's just a complete part of your life. Having the museum as a third place in your life will almost guarantee the drive for lifelong learning. So applying new media to encourage the museum as a third place or a place for lifelong learning, as we said, it all comes back to personalization, allowing the visitor to create their own experience. If we look at the typical museum setting, we can imagine an exhibition with a guided tour. In a docent tour, the audience is guided through the museum in a specific direction. In an audio tour, it is similar. However, with new technologies, we can put emphasis on the viewer, giving them not only the ability to choose their audio, but we can supplement that information. Think about the iPod or now iPad tours that are going on. Museums can use the program as a multimedia presentation to supplement the exhibition. But if the museum viewer can branch off into that different research by connecting to the object to different information not on display or through web searches and articles related to that object, allowing the visitor to consistently create their own meaning and personalizing their experience. At the same time, museums are experimenting with tagging objects with systems that can be used in gallery devices or where people can be emailed information for later investigation to extend the museum visit. Extending the museum visit is where we reach into our online repertoire, utilizing new technologies to find new ways to connect the audience with museum objects. The online experience will continue to get more interactive and more personal as new technology emerges. It is in this area that we will see the most advancements to use the museum as a place of lifelong learning. The museum essentially is used as the hub for which people learn and experience objects. That refers to all aspects of life and all stages of life. Through new technologies, we are able to captivate everyone in more and new ways, allowing using the collection as a focus for social interaction, education, and personal entertainment. The underlying concepts to lifelong learning is to move learners through life in different learning opportunities. The museum works as that base to which learners move through learning opportunities, building each experience into their life, always having that focus of the museum to work from. I did want to leave time for questions, so that's really the introduction. I missed a couple things from the chat, but if we have any questions or discussion, I'd love to talk about any aspects on the museum and how it can really serve as that focus and that hub for learners to connect throughout their life.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy. We'll try and host the questions if people want to type them into the group chat channel, and I'll pass them on to you in voice so that you can focus on them. The first question I had was, we wondered if you could share some of the strategies you're actually using at your own museum.
At the Musk Valley, we're a university museum, and we're a relatively small museum. Our collection is only 4,000 works, and we have a great luxury because we're a college campus, a college university, on a college campus, and one of our main campaigns is social media. We do this because one of our main audiences is college students. So we've got Twitter and Facebook and blogs and wikis and different things for the students to really engage in their work. We actually do not have an online collection right now, but that is one of our next strategies, is to create a dynamic, interactive online experience for the viewer, but we're still exploring all the different options. I mean, there's tens of thousands of collections that are online, or different, not tens of thousands, that may be an exaggeration. There are hundreds of different software that you can use to create an online exhibition or a searchable database. So that's where we're at now, is documenting and putting it online. But that social media is really one of the major pushes, and I will post URLs in a second.
Okay, that would be great if you could put the URL into a chat for everybody, and they can click directly on the URL and open it up in a browser from Second Life. So Tony asked, do you have a user-centered interactive tour? I assume that's at your museum.
Yeah, I was trying to copy the link into the text. We do, to the point that we have a customizable iPod tour, audio tour, but because of our limitations in budget, we're actually not able to explore as much as I would like. It's just a circumstance of funding and research. But we have dreams and hopes of many interactions.
And Alan again actually asks you to comment on what happens when the tech that you've invested so much time and energy into disappears. Do you actually lose content? I mean, an example is galleries in Second Life that no longer exist. I mean, in many cases, the actual content that they hosted disappears too. In a physical museum, presumably your pieces are still there, but the work that's gone into the new technology presumably evaporates.
That's actually a very interesting question that came up at another conference, the Web 3.0, 2 years ago. You know, it was probably 3 years ago, actually 4 years ago by now, that where Second Life was, oh, look at all the possibilities in museums. And the audience, not being familiar with Second Life, said, well, what happens when Second Life goes away? Well, Second Life may not be here, but there's always going to be some degree of a virtual reality. There's always going to be some degree of that technology. So we might have to reinvest additional time to make it adapt to the new technology, but that base is always going to be there. That base concept of a virtual world, or the base concept of a wiki, or the base information of a collections database, it's going to change form and it's going to change shape, but it's similarly always there. We just have to adapt to it, and it's much easier to adapt to something that's new rather than starting from scratch. So I think that we will be able to continue, even if Second Life goes down, for example, we'll be able to take some of that programming and some of that time and apply it to what's next.
Okay, and that's good to know. And coming from virtual worlds background myself, particularly with the new viewer, where we can use other technologies and media to actually most appropriately display the information that you have, and Second Life really is best then used simply as a three-dimensional environment to provide a navigational basis for people moving around. And of course we very much hope to see more of that here. More questions. How do you deal with the online database development costs, you know, if you have to employ programmers and specialists in IT for this kind of thing?
That is usually the stopping blocks for all museums, is the cost invested in it. There's no easy answer for that. There are some great grant programs put out by the NEA and NEH that offer full funding for digitizing your collection. Depending on the nature of your collection, this is somewhat feasible. For us, for example, at the Musk Valley, we have 4,000 works and probably only 75% of them fully documented, ready for already digitized or ready for a collections database. So not having the entire collection is even a hindrance, because you've got to have somebody photographing it, you've got to have somebody cataloging it, and putting the entire thing together. The costs that are incurred, you know, you can't manufacture money, unfortunately, even virtual lindens, but we can do things slowly, and you can do things in increments. You might not have your entire collection put up overnight, but you can start with the couple hundred that you have. For example, you're going to see our wiki as soon as I find the URL in the chat. It's not our entire collection, but it's a portion of our collection to get the conversation going, to start engaging the visitor with. And I think the incremental steps is really where we can start, because most people can't. A digital project collection can cost anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million depending on the size and scope and plan.
Okay, for sure. So the inevitable iPad question, are you excited about it in terms of the larger screen and the capability for perhaps better self-guided tours?
Absolutely. We tried to pre-order them. We weren't quite qualified months ago for the programming version because of our size, but you know, the capabilities of augmenting the museum experience inside the gallery with the iPad they're simply endless. You know, they're essentially pretty easy, just like it is to create audio tours or virtual multimedia tours on the iPod. We can do the same thing with an iPad, except even more enhanced, because we'll get the larger screen and sort of an easier navigation system than someone trying to fuddle with an iPod.
Okay, and Jana asks, if a museum had a small fund to develop new tech to use, what would be at the top of your priority list? I mean, presumably what do you see as being currently the most effective way of spending money to invest in new technology?
I think the first best way, if museums are not doing it, is to engage in social media, because essentially it's free. Yes, it does take a lot of staff time. That can't be forgotten, but it's a no dollar cost. So when you've got a couple extra hours in your time, it's a really great opportunity for you to engage with your visitors or new visitors in an entirely new way that they wouldn't see before. The second thing is, and that's something that's very affordable, is to create online exhibitions. You don't need technical information, you don't need technical support, because there's companies like Pachyderm and other sort of instant web page creators where you can create a small exhibition highlighting your collection, highlighting portions without much effort, without much investment. And that's a way for people to engage in your museum without having the full collection, without having the database, without having, you know, the full sort of scope of things.
Okay, I suppose this is going to answer the next question to some extent, because using social media is so cheap, but Tony Nelson does actually say, does this leave smaller museums behind? Does it make them less attractive or appealing if they lack the opportunities to use this new technology?
I don't think it leaves smaller museums behind. It does limit us. You know, the Muscarelli being a prime example, I consult for other museums that have larger budgets, and it's nice to dream. But in the Muscarelli, we are limited by budget and by time. We can only do so much with what we have. I think that it's a very individualized question, because every museum is different. Every philosophy is different. Every concept is different. Each museum has to examine their resources and how they can best use those resources. In a smaller museum, they may not have as many online exhibitions, but they can still have online exhibitions. They may not have as much social interaction, but they can still have some. And again, this concept of personalization and meaning making is dependent upon their audience. So each museum has to sort of do this needs assessment for how they can connect their current audience or potential audience to those collections. And sometimes we do have to be clever about it as far as funding and resources.
Okay, and in fact, Tony Nelson asked another question earlier, which I think links in with the previous one, and addresses the other side of the coin, which is, how do you see these strategies working for populations that have social media access issues? Is it going to disenfranchise or exclude them from experiences?
I think, again, that's going to come down to the individual museum. At the Musgrelli, for example, our social media is not anything that you can't experience in the museum. It's reaching out to people that don't have the capability or don't have internet or don't have these interactions is the exact same problem that museums face in getting people through the doors. Where the museum has the possibility and the capability of having anyone in the world as an audience, if they can get here, if they can walk in the doors. It's the same thing with social media. It's only going to be relevant to those people that are working and are performing and have access to all of these accounts and all of these different capabilities. So it's not excluding people necessarily, as it's giving a different venue or a different medium to what's possible. It's expanding the doors of the museum.
Okay, which can only be a good thing. I think we've dealt with most of the questions I've had, but if I've missed any, if people would like to throw them into chat again, just so that I can relay them on.
Posted my email address. I'm more than glad to talk to anyone about any ideas or concepts they have, because the other thing about interactive media and new media and social media and all these emerging technologies is that it opens up museums to work with almost any field. So you don't have to be a museum person, you don't have to be a museum goer, you don't have to be a museum professional to utilize the museum and the collections in new ways, connecting it to your employees, connecting it to your services, or connecting it to your life.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you again, Amy, for a great talk and some really some interesting answers to quite searching questions. I think we'll appreciated that and learned something from it.
Thank you for inviting me, and again, please feel free to email me and about any questions.
Okay, so the next session will be starting in approximately 20 minutes time in the same venue. So that'll be at 11 a.m. SL time, Pacific time. And for that session, Craig Capp from the College of New Jersey is going to be discussing augmented reality in the classroom.